This is probably going to be my last video on the Nintendo Switch OLED model unless I buy it in October for unboxing and review purposes, and unless we get some more major news on the console, which we probably won't. So aside from those two situations, this might be the last one that I do on the OLED model, and it's mostly to be focused on why we won't get a Switch Pro or a 4K Switch probably at all, or at least in the near future. If we are going to get a 4K Switch, there probably won't be until the next generation of Nintendo consoles. Now, I want to explain reasons why. This may come off as me just rambling and ranting on, but stick with me and hear my points. And if you have any disagreements, just let me know in the comments, but don't be a dick about it. Just, don't get too upset. I know how Nintendo fans can be. I am kind of a Nintendo fan myself. I haven't been a lifelong Nintendo fan. Yes, I had previous Nintendo consoles, but I didn't really care about Nintendo until the Switch. So I consider myself a Nintendo fan, and I'm just keeping it real with you guys, letting you know reasons why something may or may not happen. So we're going to talk about why a 4K Switch is not going to happen. And one of the things that I want to talk about with that is the price that it will cost. Now, you look at the OLED model and it's $350 before taxes. And the running joke that I see is you pay another $50 and you got a PS5, which is, the all digital PS5. But you take a look at that $50 price difference and you realize that there is also a huge gap in performance from the Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation 5. And it's only going to cost you an extra $50. So if you consider the fact that if a 4K Switch was to exist, it'll probably cost around $400, which is fine because it's still going to be cheaper than buying a standard PS5 or a Xbox Series X if it's $400 for a 4K Switch. But the problem with that is Nintendo has said this over and over again. Their main focus is software and not so much hardware. Even Doug Bowser came out and said they would make a new hardware when they feel like it is time for a new hardware. Knowing how Nintendo has been in the past, that typically means that a new hardware, even though the OLED is a new hardware, but a brand new hardware probably won't happen until the next generation console for Nintendo. We all know that Nintendo likes to release their consoles a bit early. The Wii U, I believe, released before the PS4 and the Xbox One, and now the Switch released before the PS5 and the Series X. So there's that situation there where they will not do a 4K for this current Switch model. They will be for like the Switch 2 or whatever they want to call it. Now, if you're going to talk about the 2DS, the 3DS, all those different models, I'm not really going to put that in the same category, only because it's just a handheld console and not so much as a home console / handheld. And with that, yes, we did see certain games that were only exclusive to the newer 2DS and 3DS models, but there wasn't many. So when there was a whole rumor about Switch 4K exclusive titles, I don't think they were going to do that. I think it would have been a bad decision on their part because it'll require them to only make sales of those titles if people bought the 4K console. And you can't say everyone's going to buy a 4K console, a 4K Switch, because number one, not everyone will have the money for it. Number two, there may be people out there who say, you know what, my Switch is fine. It plays what I want it to play. I'm not really interested in those 4K titles anyway. So their focus is to make as many people as they can to play their consoles, okay? Now, moving on to that, when it comes to whether or not we're going to see a 4K Nintendo Switch, one of the biggest problems with that is how much space is required for each game to play in 4K. Now, there's been the talks of like some kind of patent that Nintendo had where their titles were going to be allowed to update to be able to play in 4K, but that's more so of upscaling your content to 4K, which is not as strong and as good as a media that is in 4K, developed in 4K, capable to play in 4K. There's a difference between dynamic 4K and upscaling your things to 4K. And with that, you're going to say, okay, well, we can upscale our stuff to 4K, which there are some secrets and tricks that you can do right now to do that. But when it comes to developing a title in 4K, you have to realize how much space is going to be required to develop that game in 4K. Now, I did watch a video from a game developer who made a couple games on Nintendo, and he basically talked about how Nintendo limiting the developers from using all 4 gigabytes of RAM really limits them from doing what they want to do with the game. You look at games like Doom Eternal, Ori and the Will of the Wisp, and another game that I can think of is Outer Worlds, which is some examples that he used as well, which is that they released on the other consoles first, and it took almost like half a year to get those to be ported to the Switch because of all the cutbacks they have to take. The Switch only has 4 gigs of RAM, and developers are only allowed to use 3 out of those 4 gigs of RAM. And even Capcom came out and said, look, we want you guys to make a console with more gigabytes of RAM so that we can do more with the games we want to put on your console. They wanted to put their RE engine on the Nintendo Switch, which the only game from Capcom that has the RE engine, as far as I know right now, is Monster Hunter Stories. Monster Hunter Rise. I don't know if Stories 2 has the RE engine because I haven't picked it up yet, but Monster Hunter Rise has the RE engine. But the point right here that I'm trying to make about that is, if Nintendo is not going to make the developers capable of having all gigabytes of RAM available to make the games they want to make and make them how they want it to play, they're probably not going to make a console with more gigabytes of RAM to make that happen. Apparently that last gigabyte of RAM does make a big difference in game developing. I don't know because I'm not a game developer, but according to the developer who made the video, it is a big difference. That would make a big difference. So you got to think, okay, you can put, you make a console that can play 4K games. The next problem with that are these, your game cartridges. Some people may not know this, but these actually come in different memory sizes, which is how the game fits on these cartridges. And Nintendo has to pay a certain price to get these cartridges, which is why certain games, or most third-party games, cost more on Switch than they do on other consoles, because they have to make up the money for these cards. Now, the other problem with that is first-party Nintendo Switch developers, like the ones who make Mario and Zelda, they may be fine doing their 4K games on these. They may not, because if you don't know, certain first-party games on the Switch don't even play in full 1080p. Mario Odyssey doesn't play 1080p. Breath of the Wild doesn't play 1080p. I don't think Mario Kart or Link's Awakening, they don't play full 1080p like they're supposed to. So you can imagine those games may not even make capabilities of full 4K gaming. Now, the other part I want to talk about with this is third-party developers. They have to pay a price as well to get these cards to put their games on it. And the problem is, they're not going to pay extra for the bigger size cards. They're going to cheap out for the smallest amount of size they can get to save money, and they're going to force you to download extra space on your console. For example, Mortal Kombat 11, you need about 20 gigabytes of data available on your Switch or your SD card to play Mortal Kombat, and that's before any updates that you have to add on as well. Before any DLC you have to download as well if you want DLC. But with that in mind, 20 gigabytes extra for whatever is already on this for a game that on PS4 and Xbox One is probably around 50 to 55 gigabytes. So if you get a 4K game for Switch and they cheap out for the smallest size, you would then have to download on your Switch roughly 50 gigs minimum. That's just me giving just a random number. It's pretty close because most games on PS4 are about 50 gigs minimum. There are some that are lower, but that's another story. So you think, okay, well, if a 4K Switch game is going to have me download an extra 50 gigabytes of data, you can't do that with your Switch because it only has 32 gigabytes of space. And with the OLED model, it has 64 gigabytes, so you can only have one 4K game on your Switch OLED if you have that situation. And if you're like me and any other Nintendo Switch user, you most likely have an external micro SD card added to your Switch, which most people only have up to 128 gigabytes. They may have 256. My Switch currently has a 400 gigabyte card, and it's still less than what you get included from a PS5 or an Xbox Series X, as well as PS4, Xbox One. They all come with 500 gigabytes minimum, and then the other ones come out with a terabyte. And yes, there is talks that a Switch can run a terabyte micro SD, but there also been stories where the Switch couldn't handle the requirements for the SD card, and it will overheat and it'll burn a hole through your Switch. I've seen stories and videos about that. So you have to think, okay, not only would they have to make a console that can play 4K games, the console also needs to either come with enough internal memory or have the system requirements to run external memory that won't burn a hole through your Switch. And developers themselves have to pay extra to put their games on these cartridges without requiring you to download so much extra space on the side. Now, in the case where they make you download, let's say, minimum 20 gigs on the Switch for these 4K games, that means either they paid extra for a bit bigger size card, or the game isn't in 4K, it probably runs 2K resolution. So that's the other issue there. You have to think about how all these things come together for it to work properly. Now, when it comes to the idea of price for the Switch, yes, I do believe that $350 for the OLED model is kind of lame. Now, of course, you have to think for the extra $50 price tag, you're getting an OLED screen, which is supposed to look better, but we have to, according to an IGN article, it really doesn't add much to it. So you have the newer screen, the much better kickstand, which again, that's only for those who play handheld or tabletop mode, and the improved sound speakers, which if you're playing handheld, I'm sure you're using headphones anyway. So I think if they did a 4K Switch, it would cost around $400 maybe, at most $450, which is a lot. But if they made a 4K Switch and they charge $400, and it does play games in 4K, and developers make their games in 4K, you will see people buying it who have the money because it's still cheaper than buying a PS5 and an Xbox Series X. Now, the counter to that of why it's not going to happen is because the Switch is the best-selling console currently. And the reason for that is simple. The Switch was out long before the PS5 and the Series X, and it's a lot cheaper. Before tax, a Switch is $300, so you still have that extra $150 to $200 that's not being used for that other console, because the other consoles are $500, Switch is $300. You do the math. You could even buy if you're one of those who want to have a Switch at home and a Switch to take with you, you can buy a Switch and a Switch Lite for the same price as a PS5 or a Series X. So Nintendo probably won't make a 4K Switch because they don't want to charge you any more than they already do charge you, because they want their console to be at as many homes as they can get it to, and they want their games to be played by as many players in the world. So there really isn't much more I can say about it. Just to sum everything up, you have developers have to pay extra for the bigger space cards to put 4K on their games. The Switch would need to have more internal memory or support for larger SD cards to run the 4K games, and they would also have to get the components to make their Switch in 4K and charge you an extra $50 to $100 depending on which model you're comparing it to. Not to mention, if they do make a 4K console, what's going to happen in terms of taking that console in handheld mode? Will it just drop to 1080p, or will it drop down to 720? Or would it be like a prediction I had a while back where the Switch is dockable and handheld, the Switch Lite is only handheld, a Switch Pro may only be dockable. It could come out that way where the Switch 4K can only be docked to play it in 4K, and therefore you can't make it handheld. Just some things to think about as to why we may never get a Switch 4K in this generation. We may get one in the next Nintendo console while it's already halfway through the PS5 and the Series X. Just like the Wii U came out before those other consoles, the Switch came out before these consoles, so we may not see it until the Switch 2. Maybe they'll change the name to another Nintendo game box switching cube, whatever you want to call it. That's just what my thoughts are. This is a long video, I know, I'm sorry. It just had to be said. But let me know in the comments what you think. If you want to have another discussion about it, or you want to hear me have a discussion with other people, let me know. I can make arrangements with people to talk about it in more detail. But that's my thoughts. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Later.